Now, recently, the American Prospect sat down and spoke with the White House chief strategist, Steve Bannon. Now, what's interesting about the American Prospect is that it's a progressive publication. And Steve Bannon, out of nowhere, reaches out and says, hey, I would like to have an interview. Would you like to interview me? That's strange. Why wouldn't he reach out to an alt-right publication or another right-wing publication? Why reach out to progressives? That's very strange. Now, in this interview, he actually said some very interesting things, and he was speaking to a man named Robert Kuttner. Now, he writes, Bannon was in high spirits when he phoned me on Tuesday afternoon to discuss the politics of taking a hard line with China and minced no words describing his efforts to neutralize his rivals at the Department of Defense, State, and Treasury. Now, what's interesting is, of course, we know Bannon as not getting along with the Washington establishment. We get that, okay? And so, of his rivals, he said, very interestingly, quote, they're wetting themselves. And basically what he did is that he explained the plan of trying to get rid of people like Gary Cohn, H.R. McMaster, and others. So he's like, yeah, these guys are my rivals. I want to replace them. I think that, and interestingly enough, he said on some of these people, especially on foreign policy, he says they're too hawkish. They're too hawkish on war, but they're also too easy on trade. So what I want to do is I want to replace somebody who's more hawkish on trade. Very interesting. Okay. Now, trade specifically deals with China. Now, on that, he said, we're at economic war with China. It's in all their literature. They're not shy about saying what they're doing. One of us is going to be a hegemon in 25 to 30 years, and it's going to be them if we go down this path. Now, what path? Well, right now, I guess free trade. That's my guess on what he means about that. Of course, our trade relationship with the Chinese and with the Asian region is a very difficult concept that we have. There's a lot of different free trade deals that we have. And of course, some of them have been very, very damaging to the United States, especially when it comes to manufacturing. A lot of our manufacturing base has gone to China, and little places like Walmart import lots of cheap Chinese goods. Well, that's stuff that could actually be manufactured in the United States, better quality, and actually create jobs. So on trade, look, let's be honest. On trade, we're not necessarily too different, progressives are, because we actually want fair trade that benefits American workers. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, he said, Bannon said he might consider a deal with China, and this is on North Korea, by the way, with China that got North Korea to freeze its nuclear buildup with verifiable inspections and the United States removed from its troops in the peninsula. But such a deal seemed remote. Given that China is not likely to do much more on North Korea, and the logic of mutually assured destruction was its own source of restraint, Bannon saw no reason not to proceed with tough trade sanctions against China. Now, I don't know if I agree with trade sanctions against China, but I do agree with changing the way that we trade with China, changing the free trade agreements so that most of our manufacturing does not go and outsource itself to to China and to these other Asian countries that pay their workers very, very little. Okay. Now, that would be, of course, an interesting thing to do, but I don't see a lot of our people doing that. Now, on North Korea, he happens to make a little bit of sense. He says there's no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threats. Forget it. Until somebody solves part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. And unfortunately, he's correct about that. And it's a very interesting position to have, since we also share that we do not want to go to war with North Korea. We are worried about Seoul. We're also worried about Japan. We're worried about Guam. All the things in that, all the places in that area that could be potential targets for North Korea. So yeah, that's why we're not interested in the war. And apparently, Steve Bannon also not interested in the war. It's a very interesting position to have. Now, Here's where I go to one of the reasons why the establishment hates him. He wanted to raise taxes on the rich and not go to war against other countries. Again, there's a lot of things that I dislike about Bannon, but there are some things that he advocates that actually do make a little bit of sense. And I know it might be controversial to say that, but you got to call it the way it is. It doesn't mean I agree with Bannon on everything. It doesn't mean that I agree with Bannon on, even half of what he believes in. But at the same time, there are some things that are common sense positions, like not going to war with North Korea and actually doing something with the trade deficit when it comes to China. Because again, that is hurting American jobs, and it is hurting the economy. So now, more interesting stuff about Bannon. He said, when asked about the connection between his program of economic nationalism and the white nationalism epitomized by the racist violence in Charlottesville and Trump's reluctance to condemn it. Now remember, when this happened, Bannon's like, yes, he's defending my people, our people. So already it makes you think that, well, wait a minute, he's in favor of these white supremacists, right? Well, he says something to the opposite, which is very curious. He had dismissed the far right as, quote, irrelevant, and had sidestepped his own role in cultivating it when he was working at Breitbart. He said ethno-nationalism, it's losers. It's a fringe element. I think the media plays it up too much, and we got to help crush it. Help crush it more. He says, quote, these guys are a collection of clowns. Now, wait a minute. These guys, the white nationalists that you defended on Tuesday, that you were so ecstatic about Donald Trump equivocating with the counter-protesters, now you're going out and saying, what a bunch of clowns and losers. Again, he's talking to a progressive publication. That's got to tell you something. It's got to tell you that he's lying, or he's playing the media, which involves lying. So, but again, this is a very interesting kind of bonkers interview, right? Now, what we know about Bannon, let me tell you about the truth about Bannon, okay? So, he is a deeply racist individual. Now, again, he just called ethno-nationalists, white nationalists, a fringe element, and the losers, right? But what we know is that he is a white nationalist, at least in some of his views. In fact, it can be summed up in something called the Camp of the Saints. Now, the Camp of the Saints is an old French book, okay, which was deeply, deeply racist. And yet, right now, he talks about immigration as in, we're in a Camp of the Saints moment. Now, let me give a quick sort of summary, because I did a big story on that months and months ago. Maybe it was even during the campaign, where I talked about where he gets this belief and what this book actually espouses. Now, this book basically sums up portrays an immigrant invasion into the United States and all over the Western world, where, black people were taking over, brown people were invading the United States, led by somebody known as the shit eater, who literally ate poop. Okay, that's sort of how he feels about immigrants coming into the United States, who at least are not from, Western Europe, okay, non-white immigrants. And he's also against people who refuse to assimilate. So there's that white nationalism in a way. Now, he says, no, I'm not a white nationalist. I'm actually an economic nationalist. Now, I think some of that is actually true. He is partly economic nationalist as well. Example, his idea with, hey, let's do sanctions on China because they're screwing us in trade. Hey, let's tax the rich here at home and do some infrastructure spending. So that's stuff that is more economic populist, right? Economic, I guess he would call it economic nationalist. But the views from the Camp of the Saints are certainly white nationalists. That's very, very racist. So I think what he was doing is that he was playing this in order to try to do some ties with progressives. Well, we're not buying it. We know exactly what Steve Bannon is about. Now, there's more, of course. He also tends to believe that the banks, the media, and Hollywood are all run by the Jews. Again, deeply racist and anti-Semitic. Now, there are problems with the banks, and there are problems with the media, of course, but it's not because of Jews. Okay, it's because of corporate greed. So, look, it's hard to peg him in completely one spot, because there are some things that he's actually decent on and makes sense on, and there's other things where he's deeply, deeply racist and nationalist and anti-Semitic. But this is who Steve Bannon is, and this is who the person is that the president has unfortunately painted himself into a corner with. Again, going back to Charlotte here, he did talk about how President Trump, despite him being on the outs, despite Trump being incredibly angry about him for being a White House leaker, or allegedly being the White House leaker, he still goes and defends the alt-right and his people. Now, there's one more thing here that I want to talk about, and this is about the Democrats. Now, he said in this interview, quote, "The Democrats, the longer they talk about identity politics, I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity, and we go with economic nationalism, we can crush the Democrats." Now, that's very interesting, because I think he's right to a degree. Now, if you focus on economic issues, then yes, you do economic populism like Bernie Sanders, you're going to do very, very well in an election. But you also have to talk about racial justice. It's racial and economic justice. That's how you win the day. Because, look, right now, the establishment is keeping both white working class Americans and people of color down. Because guess what? The working class just isn't white. The working class involves everyone who are in the working class. Black people are part of the working class. You have a lot of Latinos that are part of the working class. Asian Americans. There's just a working class. That is not the white working class, not the black working class. It's just a working class. And right now, establishment neoliberal policies are crushing the working class. And something needs to be done about it. Now, if Democrats actually run on a platform of racial and economic justice, which run hand in hand, then they could easily beat whatever Donald Trump and Steve Bannon counter with, which is, yes, a mix of economic populism, but deeply intertwined with hatred. Love tends to win over hatred. I'm just saying. Now, the system, of course, is crushing, as I mentioned, is crushing a lot of people in the working class, people of color. You also have policing. You also have the school to prison pipeline. You also have incarceration of African Americans that are out of balance. You also have the drug war. You also all these different things that are inherent in the system. Any campaign that promises to dismantle those systems, again, that's going to get wide popular support. So Steve Bannon is sort of right, but he's also sort of wrong because he misses something very, very important. Okay? Yes, there is economic populism that is super important, but there is not a binary choice. It's not a choice between racial justice and economic justice. That's actually, they're intertwined. Okay? They go hand in hand. And so let me give you a quote here from Martin Luther King Jr. here. He said, "Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality, for we know that it isn't enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee?" So that's what we win on. We win on both. Bannon, he is on the wrong side of that. And yes, when you pit a right-wing populist versus an establishment figure, if the establishment is crushing people and hurting people right now, Unfortunately, as we've seen, you're going to end up seeing the right-wing populist win. But if you have a left-wing populist versus a right-wing populist, somebody like Bernie Sanders versus a Donald Trump or a Steve Bannon, then you're going to see a left-wing populist win every time. Because again, it's Americans are drawn to a message of hope, not a message of hate. One more thing, too. I do want to address his talk about identity politics, right? Oh, it's the left in the identity politics. Okay, so yes, the left does play identity politics. However, if you're a white supremacist or a white nationalist, you are also playing identity politics. And it's very, very ironic. Because, and let me kind of lay this out simply. White supremacy is basically based in the belief that your race is superior to everyone else. That's why they call it white supremacy. That in itself is economic, or not economic, I'm sorry, identity politics. That is identity politics to the T. So that's just a little bit of irony that I want to point out. But look, like I said, racial justice, economic equality, they go hand in hand. And when you actually have a platform that fights on those two issues, they win. And that's why in the end, real progressives will win the fight. And always have. And we will always have progress. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.